The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 13th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
And as he came out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. But these are but the beginnings of the birth pains." The word of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. It's very... this passage is located in such a way that it's hard to know where to begin and to stop with it. The word that they use, we have a lot of words, a lot of Christian words. In fact, today we'll be talking about various Christian words. The words we use to describe this are words like lectionary, but also another word for the readings that we have on Sunday is called pericope, which means to cut around. And sometimes when we cut around, it is kind of funny because it's like when you cut coupons and you try and cut around those little dotted lines. Sometimes you accidentally cut too much of the coupon, or maybe you don't even use scissors. It's really easy to rip those things. And so sometimes the pericopes are just too short. Now, this pericope takes up pretty much all of chapter 13, or at least what this is dealing with. It's called Jesus' Little Apocalypse. And I'm just waiting for someone to get in their mind that that would be a really good children's Bible thing. Jesus' Little Apocalypse. It is hard because I wish that, this would be a homework assignment. Maybe just go home and read the rest of Mark chapter 13. Because this whole section is dealing with this. And it's a very confusing passage. It's very confusing because, unfortunately, we have such a thing called presentism. Presentism is just thinking about the present, seeing everything from the present. Sometimes this is good. A lot of times this is bad because we fail to take in other influences. And so our vision is very limited. In fact, that's really what the subject is here, is just the limited vision of people. And how, when they ask Jesus about things to give them to the whole spread, they get confused. And that's very reassuring. This is the wonderful thing about Mark, is when you read Mark, especially when you get one of those really good readable translations, when you read Mark, you realize these disciples are so thick-skulled, and it gives you tremendous hope. This is the wonderful thing. And we're going to be talking today about words. Words are obviously one of my favorite things. I like talking about words. It reminds me of the time when I bought a book on books. And Amy said, "Why did you buy a book on books?" And I understand what she meant, but boy, it was one of the best books that I read. I want to talk to you about words. I want to talk to you about how words change their meanings. Boy, we know that. Even growing up, we had words that changed meaning. When we talk about radical, I remember radical was really popular in the 90s, but it comes from the Greek, the Latin word root. That's what it means. It's a root. It's the central piece of something. I think one of the most interesting things a few years ago, several years ago actually, Oxford had this daily blog before there were blogs, and they talked about different language issues, which for most of you is a good cure for insomnia. Maybe you'll read it before you go to bed. It'll help you out. You'll be out faster than a warm glass of milk. For me, it's just fascinating. And they talked about the word silly. Now, we think of the word silly as this, but if you were to go back in time to the Middle Ages, in the Old English, and you were to say, you're silly, someone would take that as a compliment because it meant blessed. It meant someone who was, very fortunate in their lives. And over the years, what happened was the word silly eventually evolved from someone being blessed by God, touched by the hand of God, to being, touched a little touched in the head. And then silly just kind of traipsed down that little road there. English has these old words. And I think it's also important for us to know that this happens with a lot of theological words. In fact, a lot of the words that Christians use, we've kind of allowed them to escape from us. We've put them out there on the open market, and unfortunately people have picked them up and they've misunderstood what we said. And I don't think there's anything really intentional about it. I don't think there's anything sinister, which by the way just means left-handed. I don't think there's anything intentional about it. I'm going to throw in all the etymology I can today. I just think it's something that happens and we have to be on our guard. I don't think there's any word that's more like that than apocalyptic. What do we think of when we think of apocalyptic? I know we're Lutherans, so I won't put anybody on the spot, but any volunteers, I'll even turn around if you need me to. What do we think of when we think of apocalyptic?
End of the world.
End of the world. Boom. Earthquakes. We think of something very cataclysmic happening. The word apocalyptic just means to reveal. It's where we get the word revelation from. It's a direct translation. This word, it just means to reveal. It means to open up. And of course, anyone who's trying to put too much stuff into too small a container knows that something's going to happen. Either it's going to overflow or explode. And that's usually what happens when God's plans are revealed for us. That's why so many people have trouble with the book of Revelation, for instance. It's just your mind explodes as you're trying to grasp this. And Mark chapter 13 does that. And so what we do as human beings is we try and organize things in ways that are like things we understand. And sometimes that works for us. And sometimes that doesn't work for us. And I think Mark chapter 13 is definitely one of those cases where it doesn't really work for us. It doesn't really work for us. Because we look at this and our immediate reaction in Mark chapter 13 is terror. All of these things are happening. All of this horrible stuff. The temple's coming down and there are wars and there are people betraying one another. And it's just frightening. And yet Jesus is talking about this. Where's the gospel in this? That's really the question. And the problem isn't so much what Jesus is saying. That's not the problem. The problem is the way we're listening to it. Now, as we go through this, I want you to just imagine what would happen if you heard these words, not from the human perspective, not from the perspective of the world is all that we've ever known, but from God's perspective. From God's perspective, seeing the world that He created be good and then fall into chaos. And He's got to make it good again. So the passage moves from the disciples' admiration of worldly glory to the disciples' inquiry about salvation's timetable. And finally, the disciples' reassurance. The disciples' admiration of worldly glory, the disciples' inquiry about salvation's timetable, and the disciples' ultimate reassurance. Now, our gospel picks up with Jesus exiting the temple. This is a very funny place to start. Jesus, in Mark's gospel, we have other passages, especially in John, where Jesus has already gone to the temple. But here, this is the only time where Mark records Jesus in the temple. And Jesus is leaving the temple. Now, it's very important for us to notice. Jesus is exiting the temple. Jesus then goes. He has stymied the religiously self-important, and he has lifted up an example, the woman who's giving the last that she has, she's putting that in the offering plate, and he says her faithfulness will be preached about. And so he's lifted up the lowly, who've given everything by faith, and he's torn down the self-important religious leaders. And then he exits. He leaves the temple, he's done with it. This is something we often miss. But Mark is always focused on letting people know that there's something more. He's very economical. And where Jesus is located in this passage is so important. As they're exiting, an unnamed disciple declares just how amazing the temple is. It should be noted that this temple was not one that God necessarily authorized. This was a temple built by a foreign so-and-so who wanted to get in the good graces of both the Romans and the Jewish people, and so he built them a very elaborate temple. And so they're marveling at this temple, which was probably built for the wrong reasons. And as they're walking away, Jesus declares that everything's going to get torn down. Everything's going to get torn down. Not one on top of the other. It would be nice to think that maybe this was something unique to Jesus, but Jesus is really citing Old Testament prophecies, especially from the books of Ezekiel and the books of Micah, where Jesus looks and he says basically what the Old Testament prophesied. But I think it's really important for us to remember that the temple is gone. Jesus, God himself, God incarnate, has left the temple. He's gone out of the temple and he's left it behind, and there's nothing there for it anymore. It's going to be rubble. It's not that it's bad, it's that it's outlived its usefulness. So where does Jesus sit? Next, he gathers his disciples. He gathers them on the Mount of Olives, and it's very interesting. This goes back to a prophecy that's in the book of Zechariah. Many of us aren't really familiar with the book of Zechariah. Zechariah in our Bibles is like the second to last book in the Bible, the minor prophet. But then you read Zechariah. If you've ever read the book of Revelation, you read Zechariah and you're like, boy, this all sounds familiar. Because Zechariah is apocalyptic language. It's apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature pops up all throughout. These are the moments. This apocalyptic literature isn't like Nostradamus. It's not like reading tea leaves. Apocalyptic literature is when God's full glory comes and overwhelms people, and past and future blur together, and all they can see is God at work. That's what it means to be revealed. And so here in Zechariah, there's this revelation all through this book. And Zechariah 14:4 talks about the end of all things. It talks about how God's going to come and he's going to clear everything away. All the debris, all the detritus that's accumulated in our sorry world, which anyone who's picked up a newspaper knows something has got to change. And God is the one who's going to change it. And that's going to be the day of judgment. And Zechariah 14:4 talks about it. And where does he talk about God coming? On the Mount of Olives. Just opposite. There in the Mount of Olives, across from the temple, Jesus lays out the end of all things and how the world is finally going to come to a close. When the curtain falls and the actor takes the stage and the great director takes the stage and the show's over and everyone will live happily ever after. So there, across from the temple, having left there, in the Mount of Olives, the place where the declaration about how God is coming to redeem the world, Jesus begins speaking to them, it says. He begins to lay out, as the disciples ask, tell us the timetable. We want to know how things work. Boy, we're so small-minded, aren't we? We want to know how things are going to work out. We're so busy asking how things work out that we forget why. We forget to ask, why is God doing these things? Because He loves you. Because He can't stand to see you miserable. Because He can't stand for you to be apart. That's why. We want to know how things will pan out. We want to catch a glimpse of the apocalyptic. And it's doubtful that any of us can truly handle it. Because we're trying to filter it through our own small minds. This is why Jesus lays out all of the portents and predictions that people parade out in order to heighten their insightfulness. And He lays all of these things out. There's going to be wars, there's going to be famines, there's going to be all sorts of stuff. There are going to be people coming in my name. Anybody who's caught late night, really late night television, knows that every once in a while you see a couple of preachers. Definitely who've got their hair done better than I do. Usually in much nicer suits than I'd ever wear. And they're telling you just how you can be saved. And there's a little 1-900 number at the bottom. Jesus says, don't listen to them. There'll be people coming on the news and they'll say, well, this just proves that the end of the world is at hand. This just proves there's never been anything like this. Meanwhile, the historians in the back are raising their hands and saying, yes, we've seen this all before. We've seen this before. Don't worry. Do not be afraid. I think that should be kind of one of the central phrases in apocalyptic literature. When we read the book of Revelation, maybe we should also read Don't Panic in big friendly letters. I think we should remember Don't be afraid. Fear not's mentioned over and over in the Bible. Some people speculate that it's mentioned over 365 times, one for every day of the year. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. People are going to come to you. They're going to lie. They're going to cheat. They're going to start wars. They're going to start violence. They're going to hand people over. They're going to make little deals. Don't be afraid. So many apocalypticers lay before people the falling away of earthly hopes. And that ultimately leads people hopeless. You see, the disciples, when they ask, what's the timetable? What's going to look like? How's this all going to work out? What they're asking is, what on earth can I put my hope in? And God and Jesus says, nothing. There's nothing on earth you can put your hope in. Because everything is going to be cleaned. Everything's going to be cleansed. Everything's going to be washed away. Everything's going to be, that's not in the holy fire of God, next to that sun that we all orbit. If it's not burned away, that's what will be left. Nothing on this earth you can put your hope in. And there may be a demand that we put our trust in them, maybe not in them, but maybe in our own works. Maybe we're afraid. We're afraid that the promises of Jesus Christ are too good to be true. That the free gift of grace is too good to be true. And so we look to our own works, our own abilities, our own willpower in order to justify us before God. I love how Luther puts this. It's, which of your pitiful works will impress God more than the death of his own Son? What are you going to bring before God? What are you going to bring before God that will impress him more than Jesus Christ? His death and resurrection. What are you going to put before God? What plans do you have to get in good with God that are better than the plans that God had for the salvation of the world? Jesus' answer, thus, is to acknowledge that we live in a fallen world, where the things that we place our hope in never satisfy us. When faced with false prophets, we should keep following Jesus. When faced with wars and rumors of war, we should not be afraid. When faced with the powers of the world gearing up for another power grab, we should understand that this way of thinking and living will pass away. It's going to pass away when the new heaven and new earth come into being. Jesus refers to it as the birthing pains, which is a common refrain throughout New Testament and Old Testament literature. Jesus wouldn't have been saying anything new, anything people hadn't heard before. Micah 7:6 talks about how people would hand over others. And Isaiah mentions in 19:2 earthquakes. I'm sorry, that's where he mentions the civil wars. Earthquakes are mentioned in 13:13. Famines in 14:30. Jesus isn't saying anything new. He's bringing the drama, the promised drama of the Old Testament to its conclusion. And he's laying out how this will all happen. He's laying out and saying that the temple must be destroyed. I think it's very interesting. This is why Jesus says all of this stuff on the Mount of Olives. This is where the Messiah will declare victory over the world. This is why I believe we misunderstand and misunderstood Revelation. If we look at what's revealed, and the only thing we can think of is things to be afraid of, that just shows that we're putting our hopes in worldly things that are going to pass away. It's very important for us to remember that the temple will be destroyed. Remember? Remember when Jesus was brought before the chief priests? And they couldn't get him on anything. They couldn't bring up any charges. So one of them said, well, I heard a rumor. I heard a rumor that the temple was going to be destroyed and it was going to be rebuilt in 3 days. John tells us that he was referring to the temple, which was his body. I think that's important for us to remember. God leaves, and he is the temple in Christ Jesus. That temple is destroyed, and it is rebuilt. And it's rebuilt, and not only that, but it's that hope that we rebuild our lives around. In Revelation, last week we talked about Revelation 21, and what we talk about is how there will be nothing else in the orbit of all things. There will be no need for earthly or worldly things, because the Lamb will be the light. Over and over again, we see Christ at the center of this revealed word. And what we apprehend through the eyes of faith here, what we can't understand because we're still stuck in this world, is revealed and will be revealed to all of us. And many this year have already seen or are already seeing that revelation take place. Whether we admire worldly glory or inquire about some eternal timetable, Jesus' message is the same. to all disciples, and that is to follow him. So often our neighbors are fed a series of words and phrases that have lost their meaning. And we've, as it were, allowed our words to escape and run wild, and people are renaming them or giving them different definitions. I think they need to hear what we really mean, what we're really talking about when we talk about these things. They think the church is a building instead of people filled with God's Holy Spirit. They think the apocalypse is a great destruction ahead of a promised recreation. They think that the last judgment is something they need to fear, rather than giving thanks that Christ has already confronted the last judgment and declared us forgiven. But most of all, they need to hear the gospel. They need to hear that the gospel is not something for holier-than-thou people. Rather, the gospel is the promised hope that we no longer need to be afraid. So that when Christ is speaking to us and gathering us around, we know that the Lamb is at the center and the great banquet feast has begun. And all who put their faith in him are welcome before the table. Amen.
Snow.